Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Global Gaze, where we talk art, film, and books from an international perspective. I'm your host, Dr. SarahJilani. I'm a lecturer and an arts critic. Now, I've done that critic bit for a couple of years, close to just over a decade. And throughout that time, I've been really interested in what gets to be in the big art museums and what isn't quite deemed contemporary art. So today I wanted to talk about what gets to be called art, or rather, who gets to decide. Of course, there is a degree to which things like beauty, technical skill, and conceptual depth give us the kind of, green light to call something art and to elevate it as such. But my issue is the assumption that these are apolitical concepts, that there's something universal about good technical skill or aesthetic beauty that you just recognize whenever you see it. So today, we're unpacking how value judgments around what gets to be called art and what doesn't are actually deeply related to history. After all, even the word contemporary tells us that it has to be something that is agreed on as modern and cutting edge. Now, those are pretty loaded terms when we get into who and what we consider to be of the moment and who or what is kind of assumed to be fallen behind. Then we have a political value judgment in place. So why does this matter? Well, let's start here. What we call art is a legitimizing act. To call something art is to say it matters, that it should be housed in museums or taught at schools. But these decisions about what gets to be funded, what gets to be displayed, and what gets to be taught as cutting-edge aesthetic way of seeing our world is not neutral. Sometimes I wonder if I should just rename this whole channel Nothing is Neutral. So you may have heard the phrases high culture and low culture before. The systems of power that I mentioned culture reflected were shaped by European empires. In many ways, wherever they went, they decided what counted as high culture. And of course, this meant that they could position their own aesthetics, philosophies, and histories at the center. So prioritizing some of these histories and not others already gives anyone the impression that there's certain parts of the world where culture is cutting edge. It is of its time, and that the rest of the world is somehow kind of catching up to that geographical place. Choosing what counts as contemporary art or even high culture, you're also relegating a whole bunch of other creative global practices to the periphery. Maybe you've heard of words like folksy, decorative, exotic, functional. These are all kind of qualifiers that we often see attached to the cultural production of the global South that doesn't fit the parameters of what Western art museums agree is contemporary art. This distinction between what's seen as contemporary and what's not isn't just about timelines. So it's about aligning with certain visual languages and theoretical frameworks, most of which come from the West. A sculpture made last year in London might be seen as cutting edge, but a woven basket made last week by a woman in a village in South Asia, that's often read as traditional, or worse, craft, as if it takes no knowledge, skill, or consideration to make. This is just one example, but it shows how difference isn't always traceable back to skill or meaning. So what I'm saying isn't that, let's completely do away with whatever the West calls art. And I'm also not saying that somehow global Southern cultural production has historical value but not conceptual depth or skill. But very often, unless this work mirrors either the formats and theories or the aesthetic priorities of Euro-American contexts, it can be overlooked. The reason I trace this dynamic back to the European colonization of the majority of the world is because art wasn't the only field in which this idea was imposed. This is a dynamic that scholars like Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon identified decades ago in Francophone Caribbean colonies. They recounted how, as students, they were taught that real literature, real painting, real intellect came from France. Fanon and many others described how colonized people were taught that they had to mimic the culture of the colonizer if they wished to be seen as quote unquote civilized. So here, art and artistic taste wasn't neutral. You had to have the right artistic taste. In other words, you had to elevate the culture of the colonial metropole if you wanted to be seen as an educated subject. Just like in my previous video on repatriating objects in museums, we've got that myth of universality rearing its head here as well. This directly, but more often indirectly, creates the pressure to conform. From Jakarta to Lagos to Sao Paulo, artists of the Global South are encouraged to produce work that will travel well and travel northwards. You're so much more likely to get noticed and probably paid for your hard work if you produce art that in some way fits what curators in the Global North are looking for. And I'm not letting global Southern institutions off the hook here either, because very often these standards are internalized by post-colonial governments and culture ministries. Added to that cultural or maybe social pressure is actually real material relations today. Very often, museums and art institutions in the Global South operate on loans from the Global North. If you've ever tried to get a loan or a grant for something, you know that you have to produce a lot of evidence that you are going to use those funds in a way that the lender wants you to. So you may ask, Sarah, well, what's at stake? Is the only issue here the fact that a couple of textiles and baskets aren't getting their due consideration? Well, not at all. Culture isn't just the realm of artistic creation or even literary expression. It is of the sum total of everything that we think we are and how we know our place in the world. You may recall from my very first video that I talked about the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who identifies culture as essentially your lens on the world. And if you're looking at your own world through somebody else's eyes, you're forever going to judge yourself and your surroundings based on parameters that are not your own. Similarly, when only certain things are recognized as contemporary art, entire parameters of creative expression get relegated to the background. And one of the other side effects of this value system is that very often this hits women's creative labors hardest. Across much of the world, women's creativity is embedded in the everyday, weaving mats, embroidering fabric, painting pottery. These are forms of visual knowledge, rich with symbolism, technique, and history. But because they serve a practical function, they're often categorized as craft. This distinction not only devalues the majority of artistic production in the world, but it also makes a value judgment about notions of civilization. It implicitly tells us that some cultural systems are either backward or undeveloped or uncreative or unskilled. So what gets constrained isn't just the variety and kind of art that we deem contemporary, but more politically so, the right to define what value and creativity mean in one's own cultural context. So how do we change this? Well, I'm not a museum curator and I certainly can't afford to buy art. But what's free is questioning the frameworks that we've been given. Artistic innovation may not look like a disruption, individualism, and originality, things often very prized in the Global North Circuit. It can look like cultural stewardship, continuity, care, and return. It's to recognize that the idea itself of better and worse, is determined by our political and historical reality. Whose creativity and culture are being centered, and whose is left out? Thank you so much for watching The Global Gaze. As always, please don't forget to like and subscribe so that the videos can reach more people. And I would love to hear in the comments about whether there's any piece of creative expression from your own culture that you feel should get more credit as a work of art. That's it from me for today. Thanks so much for watching, and keep your gaze global.